right, so today we are joined by Travis Kitchens. Travis is a writer from Kentucky. His writing has appeared in the Baltimore City paper, the Christian Science Monitor, and other outlets. In 2014, he volunteered for one of the Johns Hopkins psychedelic trials. That was the effects of hallucinogens and other drugs on mood and performance, which is referred to as the club drug study, for which he's writing a book on. And Symposia recently published Travis's story, Channel for Magic, Ralph Hood's Mysticism Scale and the Occult Roots of the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Program, which is what we're going to mostly be talking about today. So, Travis, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's
Thanks for being here.
We've been trying to schedule this podcast for a while. It's been a little difficult with scheduling, but I'm glad that we're finally.
It's only been a year. What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, yeah, from when you initially contacted us for the piece. Yeah, but this I mean, your piece touches on, I think, a lot of the core kind of concepts that are sort of at the center of the thing we call the psychedelic renaissance.
Yeah. Actually, I think it was published September 9th, and the initial interview that I did with Hood was September 11th, 2019. So it was it 3 years or two? Yeah, almost 3 years from the time I interviewed
don't know what
him.
year we're in anymore.
I know, I don't either. From the interview, it was 3 years. So
wow, and still relevant, highly relevant.
Yeah.
So you were in that study back in 2014. Did you get interested kind of in the roots of psychedelia after that? Was it something that you became interested? Were you already interested in psychedelics prior to going into that study?
Yeah. I mean, I think when my brother and I, whenever we were little, used to watch from the public library, we'd get Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, which is a paranormal show. And they would do ancient civilization. I didn't do psychedelics, but that I remember. But John C. Lilly was on it once. Telepathy, ancient civilizations, just the whole sort of smorgasbord of paranormal stuff. So I've always been interested in science and weird stuff. And then I lived in Virginia. My brother was in the military. And when I graduated high school, I moved out to San Diego and lived with him. And then he got transferred to Virginia Beach. And there happens to be in Virginia Beach a organization called the Association for Research and Enlightenment that was started by a man from Kentucky named Edgar Casey, who's I'm pretty sure he was a crank. I'm not going to say I'm a scholar.
Doesn't he have like the Planet X or something? Was that like Planet X?
He did a lot of Atlantis.
Oh, stuff. No, I'm confusing him with Zachariah Sitchin. Which I remember back when I used to listen to Coast when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
That was a big deal on there.
Yeah. Well, there was a bookstore there, and I think this is the best beginning is because there was a bookstore called the Heritage Bookstore. It's a typical New Age bookstore, but Casey was into holistic health, you name it, everything. Pharrell from the Neptunes is a big Edgar Casey guy, but also Johnny Cash was a big Edgar Casey guy. He was enormously popular. I mean, I don't even know who you'd compare him to, but, not Oprah level, but like the Oprah, the Secret Lady or something. It was a very popular thing, go to Edgar Casey, he'll read your fortune and tell you about your ancient Egyptian ancestors or what. So there was a bookstore there, a typical New Age bookstore. And so they had Robert Anton Wilson, Terence McKenna, John C. Lilly, and then all the New Age stuff, Native American, all that stuff that you guys know about. So I got a Leary's info psychology there and became more interested in psychedelics. And so, of course, when I moved to Baltimore, I didn't even know the studies were happening. I just was writing for the Baltimore City paper, writing a column about country and bluegrass music. And I saw the ad, Hopkins. I toggled it. I don't know how widely they advertised, but they at least advertised in the Baltimore City paper. And it said, "Have you used psychedelics?" I was like, "Oh." And it said, "We will pay you to do psychedelics." And so I was like, "Oh, hell yeah." I called right then, and Ethan Hurwitz picked up the phone, the program coordinator. And, they didn't call me back for 2 or 3 weeks. I'd sort of forgotten about it, but then finally they called back and said, "Hey, will you come in and we'll do some extra screening?" He probably asked questions over the phone too, are any of your family members mentally ill? Da 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 da. Luckily, at that time, I didn't know that much about my family members. My mom didn't know her dad, and my dad didn't really know his dad. And only really in the past couple of years have I found out things about them, including that my mother's dad committed suicide. If I told them that, I don't think they would have let me in. But I didn't know. Neither did my mom. Anyway, it wasn't a mental illness thing. He had cancer. Anyway, yeah. So they call. I would already the short answer to your question is yes. I had already been interested in psychedelics. I had no sophisticated knowledge of. I knew the basic 1960s story, and I was very, Leary and all those guys are very romantic, against authority. I was born in 1982. I'm really interested in music. So, I've always liked, the early 90s were like a gold mine if you like subversive music, Tupac, Ice Cube. I love stuff like that. The president, Dan Quayle trying to ban records. So I've always been into subversive stuff. And at that time, Leary to me, it was like, wow, this is the most subversive stuff. And of course, Terrence McKenna. This is before people really use YouTube. So there was a mail order catalog out of California called Sound Photosynthesis that you could order DVDs. And so I've got a massive collection of sound photosynthesis CDs.
Oh, that's cool.
I mean DVDs. So I had been listening to psychedelic thought, but not really taking them that much. I had taken them, but never in any ceremonial way. I puked, and I thought it was funny, but I never was like, wow, I had a religious experience. No. So after the Hopkins study, I became interested in tracing the roots because I asked Roland. I thought for sure he would have an explanation after the first session. I was like, wow, this is really fucking weird, and I was just sitting there on the couch, and after the session's over, they all come in, Roland and Matt and Fred, and everybody comes in and they sit around you. What happened? And I'm just like, oh man, that was heavy. And then so I remember asking Roland, like, what is it? I just, look, you're at Johns Hopkins, very prestigious medical institution. Roland, he seems like a scientist out of a movie. I was like, this guy's really smart. He's got to know. I thought they would have some sort of, something in your brain happened and it produced this experience. But he's like, I don't know. And I was like, I don't know. He said, yeah, I think your guess is as good as mine.
So, all right. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is there's a few things. We'll rewind a little bit, but we're going to talk about what the M scale is. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about sort of the paper that established the foundation for the research now, which is the psilocybin can occasion mystical experiences paper, which the full title of that is always a good one. It's psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance.
Not exactly a catchy title, though.
It is not.
Yeah, that's why
they shorten that.
Short. So
talk to Roland about titles.
Yeah. So Roland. We're referring to Roland Griffiths, who is the primary researcher who got psychedelic research sort of on the map again. I know. Prior to that, it was actually Strassman that restarted DMT research. I actually don't know why we say it was kind of the Hopkins team. I guess that's maybe because they're a prestigious institution or whatever, or it was just
and they're still kind of kicking and doing what they're doing. I feel like Strassman kind of did his thing and then he kind of stopped for a while. I don't know what he's doing at the moment.
So
that's right. Yeah.
So the important measurement tool that this psilocybin can occasion mystical experiences paper used was something called the M scale. And your piece, the Channel for Magic piece, it's about Ralph Hood, and Ralph Hood is he's a psychologist who developed the M scale back in the 70s. Is that correct?
Yep.
And that is also based on some prior research from other people that he had picked up on. and then there's a long strand that goes back 100 years back to William James, and so that's like some of the stuff that I want to get into. But I guess quickly, can you just explain basically, just so we have some shared understanding here, what the M scale actually is?
It's a psychometric scale, a psychometric measurement tool, or based on something called the Likert scale. It's a way to try to measure a psychological experience. Some of the early ones, in fact, the one that James was based off of, I mean, that were used back in James' time, were not used to measure drug-induced experiences, but religious conversion. So all it is somebody has an experience. Say you go to vote. In fact, some of the early scales were just this. You go to vote, and then afterwards they hand you a questionnaire. How easy was it to vote? Is there any way we could make it better? Or, a questionnaire at a restaurant, like Cracker Barrel used to have them. You remember Cracker Barrel? The little game, and then they would have the thing, how was your fried chicken? Could it be better? Was it cold? So that's really all it is. It's measuring people's responses to an experience. Is some way to get an idea of what exactly happened, since the experience is hidden. The only way that we have to express those experiences is through stories.
Subjective right? Self-report.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's all it is a way to consistently measure people's responses to a particular experience. And I think that you could do that with anything. Maybe. Have somebody to get 10 people in a row and smack the shit out of them or something, and have a questionnaire. How did it hurt? Did it really hurt? Did it sting? What was the nature of the sting? Or whatever. You can come up with anything you want. So that's all it is you have this mysterious experience. How are you going to correlate this experience to some type of therapeutic effect? How are you going to collect data in order to convince people that this is an experience that can be consistently replicated and that has particular features? You're trying to define a phenomenological experience.
Well, and I think
sorry, go ahead.
Just real quick. Yeah, there was a point I appreciated Hood made in your interview where he says explicitly, I never ever said that I measured mystical experience. I don't have that much hubris. I measured people's response to an experience. Maybe you lied, or maybe my questions were good enough so that you said, I'm going to mark it this way because there's something there that rings true. And I think that is even as we can acknowledge that these are subjective self-reports, if we look at the way so much of this is discussed both in the media and the broader sort of psychedelic discourse or in psychedelic spaces, I think that distinction gets lost frequently, and it's a really important distinction.
Yes.
I love how Dave just skipped to the end of my notes, and I had that.
It seemed relevant for where we were at. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
definitely. The other thing that I feel like I remember being sort of important was the generalizability of the scale, like between different religions, different techniques of like mystical experience and that kind of stuff, being one of the reasons that psychedelic researchers might have sort of latched onto it and been interested in it. Is that correct?
That's right, because Hood had an earlier scale. If you read, say, Ann Taves has people are interested in the literature, there's a big literature just on the scales. So Ann Taves is Hood's main historian and critic. She's got a paper called Psychology of Religion Approaches to the Study of Religious Experience. I can send you the link. Anyhow, one thing she points out is that one of Hood's earlier scales, I think it was called the Ream scale, it wasn't stable cross-culturally. So they took it to Sweden or somewhere, and the categories were from James Variety's religious experience. This is where the attributes of the ineffability and all these characteristics. Well, it didn't work there. And so he changed out the measurement, the statements that were derived from Nordic fairy tales, and then it worked. And so then Hood said, okay, he said, this is only good for liberal Protestants. This is James, right? Liberal Protestant background. This is too specific. Let me design a new one that's more generalized. So yeah,
interesting.
So there's two really things that jogs to my mind are one, in the case of MAPS, doing the, for their MDMA for PTSD, they use the CAPS assessment. And for the studies that they did in Israel, they just translated the CAPS assessment into Hebrew. But I don't know that they ever validated that translation. I don't know that they ever, and actually, funny enough, they didn't tweak things after they brought it back to Canada. And so one of the inclusion criteria for one of the Canadian studies was being fluent in Hebrew. But putting that aside, just that question of whether things are culturally consistent, and especially like when you translate things or when you bring them into new cultural contexts, and then combining that with generalizability. You mentioned Strassman, and Strassman went on this big kick around like Kabbalistic Judaism and mapping DMT states onto Kabbalistic Judaism, claiming that it was sort of the most universal language for mystical experiences, which I challenged at a Breaking Convention conference years ago, and it got kind of interesting. But this question of when we're looking at mapping spaces, one of the reasons Strassman gave for going with that is he thought there was a universality there. He thought it was a universal language. And this question of generalizability and how easy it is for people to relate to, just because a map is easy to relate to doesn't necessarily mean that it accurately maps the territory it's seeking out, to map. And I think that's sort of a significant point at the crux of mapping the ineffable.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Anne's basic criticism, again, read her paper because I'm going to simplify it, but her basic criticism is that the mystical experience, what they're calling a mystical experience, is essentially a literary construct that's used to neatly package what is really an indescribable experience that features positive and negative, has positive and negative attributes, but it gives it form and it gives it a narrative outline, and it also has the benefit of placing it in a historical context. That's a lot. And so her criticism it's very fine, but it's very interesting. I don't know what you do in response to it if you're using the scale. Oh well, she has another scale, inventory of non-ordinary states, and I know that they've developed a lot of different scales that separate the experience from the appraisal, or they think separates the experience from the appraisal. Because the problem that you run into is that the object of study is it's not just the object of study. Okay, we're going to appraise the mystical experience, but the entire concept was shaped by the literature around the concept that's supposed to be the object of study. So it's kind of a mind fuck to think about.
Plus, you're studying it through somebody's subjective experience of,
right.
Quote, the object that you're trying to study, like the layers of meaning making that are inherently piled onto that. It's some might suggest it's impossible to unravel.
Yeah. And, Hood would say, were he here, and he says it in the article, we've translated it into 30 languages. It goes for Hindus and Buddhists and da-da-da-da-da. And there's a good reliability. And I believe that I've gone through in 8 years of both sides. I can see both sides. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. Anne makes a lot of good points, and I don't land on any clear side, even having done the study and filled out the questionnaires, because my experience with the questionnaires is, look, you just took a very powerful drug, and you're sitting there for 8 hours, you're not like, oh, now I get to fill out the questionnaires. I was like, get me out of here. I hadn't eaten all day. I wanted to go.
So yeah, so how soon after like the experience is wearing off are you filling out this questionnaire, and how long how long does it take about?
Well, they've got a lot of scales. There's like 10 to 15 different scales and questionnaires you have to fill out. So it's almost immediately they get you up, and the drug doesn't care. It doesn't jump. It's not going to stop because the day's over. So one time, maybe twice, it was like, you could hear people leaving the office, and it was like, you could obviously tell it was, checkout time. And I was like, whew, like, whoa, again, you can't just turn it off. And so they come in, you talk, everybody talks, and then they give you the scales, and you sit there on the couch, with your shoes off, and they give you an iPad, and you're filling it out. Well, you've got an eye mask on all day, so also the the iPad hurts your eyes because you're just like, you don't even want to look at it. You're just like, I've had my eyes closed all day, and you're in a very dark room.
Now on this study, so this is the study that correct me if I'm wrong, but so you either get different dosages of psilocybin or placebo or DXM.
Yeah, and of course the list, they said it might be to try to throw you off, as there were about 20 different ones,
Right. Right. They listed like a bunch of different, just all kinds of drugs, right?
Yeah, that was part of the appeal, is when they give you the paperwork, they're like, it could be any of these drugs. You're like, wow. Like,
reach into this bag of candy.
Exactly.
Do you know where, on that paper, do you know where DXM falls in mystical experiences? Does it not? It doesn't. I guess since that's not the name of the paper, it doesn't occasion mystical experiences.
Oh, you mean the paper on the study I did? I could send
Yes.
it to you. It was a comparison between psilocybin and DXM, and I don't remember it being very interesting, but I can send it to you. I don't remember what the title of it is. I think it's just called Comparing DXM Effects to Psilocybin or something.
Okay. So, all right, going back to before the Hopkins program is, so back in its planning stages, which I actually don't know exactly what year. Maybe you know the year on that. So that paper's a 2006. When do you know what? Because I know the Hopkins program was sort of like clandestine for a little while. It wasn't publicized or anything. Do you know what year that actually got up and running?
I think it was 2000, but correct me if I'm wrong, if any of y'all know. I think it
All
was
right.
2000.
So, okay, so prior to that, you basically have Roland Griffiths, you have Bob Jesse, you have so Roland is at Hopkins, you have Bob Jesse who does the Council on Spiritual Practices, and he's with USONA now, amongst some other things, and you have Bill Richards. Can you talk a little bit about how Ralph Hood got into the conversation? How did Ralph become involved with the Hopkins crew, and why?
Well, they were getting the late 90s. They're, Bob Jesse suggests to Roland, let's do this study. Roland starts reading the literature. This is what I know about it. He starts reading the literature, and then there's how, what scale are we going to use? There's different scales. And so, the Good Friday experiment, of course, they used the mystical experience questionnaire, not Ralph's, but one that Leary had created. And so all it was is, what Ralph told me was, hey, we had a meeting in California. Everybody get together. How, they're planning how to do this study, and there's only a couple of different scales, and Ralph's scale was by the most reputable by that time. He had been doing it all through the 70s. He had been refining his scale. He had already had it validated and used all over the world. And so he, as Roland said, that the meeting they had, if I made it seem like in the beginning of the article, I didn't mean to, that the meeting was centered on Ralph. I didn't mean to say that. It was just a general meeting with Jesse and Roland and Bill and Ralph and other people. And
I think, was that the one that Jordan Peterson was at?
Jordan Peterson was there.
Fucking wild.
Yeah, and and they talked about the best scales to use, and Ralph, according to Roland, Ralph argued persuasively, my scale's the best one to use. And so
I want to read.
did.
I want to read you. So this is a passage of Travis in the article, and you're quoting Hood, and you say it would allow them to do two things. They being Hopkins. Hood said. They could fight the argument that the measurement was just objective nonsense, because they could say, Hood's scale has shown that you can identify mystical experiences across religious traditions among Buddhists, Hindus, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and the people who have no religious beliefs. And you can identify that same experience with people in deep meditative prayer. People who have it occur spontaneously, people who practice the presence of God with a kind of contemplative prayer, and among people who take drugs, right? So not one of those things exclusively produces the experiences. There are occasions.
That's right. So that's based on Stace's idea of causal indifference, right? Let's see, as Ralph says, gazing at the sunset, or, I remember Terrence McKenna, like that last interview he did with Eric Davis. He said, "Oh, I saw, he's dying of cancer." He says, "Oh, I saw a ladybug on a dewdrop, and I had a mystical experience." So people have these experiences, and their argument is, you look back at Catholic mystical literature, and you'll find these things that were induced in all different kind of ways. That you read Walter Hilton's book, Stairway of Perfection. There were these Catholic anchoresses, and they would build them. They would trap them in the wall, and they would, it's like sensory isolation mixed with prayer, mixed with contemplation, and they're trapped in the wall, and then there's a hole, and they put like water and food to it. But as we know, you read jail narratives of people being stuck in isolation, and they start hallucinating and all kinds of stuff. So we already knew.
I think James Kent writes about that actually in Psychedelic Information Theory. Prisoner's cinema, I think, is the term he uses on hallucinations that occur in prisoners who are in solitary.
Yeah. The John C. Lilly book, The Deep Self, he goes into those. He pulls from different jail narratives when arguing for his isolation tank and saying this is more proof that isolation, he's trying to parse out what are negative experiences and positive experiences, because obviously most people in solitary confinement don't want to be there, and it's probably not going to be a great experience.
So you mentioned Stace now. So who is Stace, and how does Stace actually link together Hood's work and kind of the counterculture Leary, Pankey, and Good Friday experiment? We're sort of going backwards here.
Yeah, because you got James' variety of religious experiences, the source text from which they're all drawing these attributes. Everybody is very impressed with the way James says, look, James has all these literary examples from, again, St. Teresa, St. John of the Cross, George Fox, people that had been inhaling nitrous oxide, Walt Whitman, whatever. It's a whole grab bag. And he says, these are the attributes. If you do a cross comparison, these are the attributes that we can say. These are the characteristics of the experience. Well, Stace was just Walter Stace was a British philosopher, and then he was a Princeton University professor and wrote books on mysticism. One's called Teachings of the Mystics. It's a compendium of where he's pulling particular narratives out of different books, which again is another whole kind of book. There's just millions of them. If you go into these New York or these New Age bookstores.
What book did the cause? It's called Causal Indifference.
No, the book that
what book did that? Is that the term?
Mysticism and Philosophy.
Do you know about what year that is?
Oh, I think it's the early 60s. I'm just going to guess. Maybe it's late 50s, early 60s.
So that comes out decades after James.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. He was just borrowing from James. And, like I said, there were already questionnaires. James' book, Varieties of Religious Experience, contains data from questionnaires, but they weren't from drug-induced experiences. They were from naturally occurring evangelical conversion experiences. And what James did was having his grad students do it. Here, take these questionnaires out there and talk to these people, and let's see. So a lot of the data it's not his. He didn't collect it. It was one of his students, Edwin Starbuck. So you can see the development from trying to measure religious experience from the late 19th century all the way through, and then you get to Walter Stace. So that's the connection between Stace and Hood, and then Hood is pulling from Stace, and so it's just it's a process of refinement, or trying to find.
And Hood's scale, was that developed? Because the origins of that are interesting too, and with all of his snake handling research and stuff. Did he develop the scale to look into that, or was he already working on that scale before he got into the snake handling?
He'd already done the scale before the snake handling. So
Okay.
he went, if I can remember correctly, well, Ralph grew up in Venice Beach, raised by a single mother in Venice Beach. And he went to grad school, I think in North Dakota, and he was studying suicidality. He was in an emergency room in a hospital, I think, there, and studying suicidality. And it was there at North Dakota where someone introduced him to William James' book. And you can imagine, if you're into William James and weird religious people, how the allure of, hey, there's these people going into trance states handling deadly serpents. I mean, like, that had to be like the best thing ever. So yeah, it was before. He did the scale before.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's obviously, if you haven't read the piece, a big portion of the piece is on Ralph Hood's research on snake handling, which is just super fascinating.
Yeah, and Travis is just a great writer on sort of that Appalachian history. That was one of my favorite parts about the piece, was just that sort of kind of path down the history of sort of folk medicine in Appalachia and stuff. And I feel like so often that region gets simplified or stereotyped and stuff, and that sort of cultural history isn't as remembered. And so it was just really cool part of the piece that I enjoyed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the folk medicine aspect I found particularly interesting, especially if you're trying to think of some alternative to industrial medicine, venture capitalist. When did people lose? I had been reading a lot of the work of, there's two great scholars of ancient medicine, John Riddle, who was, I think he's still alive, down in North Carolina, Riddle, and then John, it's not Straussbaum, I'm going to mess it up. Anyway, they're expert. Riddle wrote a book on Galen's book, on Dioscorides' book, Materia Medica, which is the first like physician's desk reference. He was the first one that had a drug book. He took all this earlier drug knowledge and he grouped it by affinity, drug effect, and that was a big innovation. But I thought that was interesting because you read these books from 2,000 years ago, and it was amazing reading about these drug markets. And they're talking openly. There's drug dealers, and the farmers were also drug dealers. And I'm like, wow, this is cool. Like, this seems like a way better idea to me than what we're doing. than doctors being paid by corporations to prescribe you and kill people, and then the corporations hiring strippers and all these other people to reward the doctors. I was just talking about this with Wendell Berry the other day. It's like, this is just obscene.
Well, and when you talk about how, or explore a bit of how industrialization really changed the terrain, like literally the terrain, right? Coal mining fundamentally altered the Appalachian terrain, but then like the social terrain, the notion that, introducing sort of time clocks around wage labor and sort of shift work and all of that disrupted the social terrain. It's funny because Normie always gives me shit for choosing to use like industrial countries rather than Western or whatever.
For that.
Well, okay, fine. You point out that it makes it sound like I'm talking about the early 1900s.
Nah,
or something.
It's called just busting your ass.
Fair enough. But the point that I like, it just feels like reading your passages on that, I think, really underscore some of the similarities to the medicalization of psychedelics and the unintended consequences and the shifts that come with that. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about for a while now, and more recently, we've been having some discussions about how medicalization changes the bar just around like drug prohibition, drug policy, right? The fact that now, rather than being able to claim simply that prohibition is a failed policy that doesn't achieve its stated ends, causes a shitload of harm, and does all this other stuff, you also have to show that these drugs are safe and effective for whatever sort of indications that you're claiming, and you invite in all of the venture capitalists, the patent attorneys, the whole machinery that industrial medicine requires. And I just thought there were some real similarities between what Appalachia has been through and what sort of psychedelia is reckoning with at the moment.
Yeah, well, if you read the folk books on folk medicine, I mentioned Catfish Gray, I mentioned Tommy Bass. What folk healers who were from the early 1900s, even into the 1950s and 60s said, we never had any problem with obesity, drug addiction, or any of these problems until the industrial medicine came in here. And it was a shift in mentality to where people, like say my grandmother, for example, every single thing she ate was out of a garden. And so if you had something wrong with you, it was not only did she have a extremely understanding of roots and trees, and made all kind of little different tinctures and extracts. But if you had something wrong with you, one, yeah, your garden is your pharmacy and nature is your pharmacy, but also you turn to alteration of diet. And the mentality here, and I can tell you, is I'm from here and I live here, is, well, just do whatever you want, and if anything goes wrong, just get surgery. Or now you go to the doctor and they'll tell you that you have some recognizable condition, but they never will say, well, a whole lot, what are you eating? What's your lifestyle like? What's your job like? Well, once you do that, or once you cut all that out, there's no way to heal. Because if you read Hippocratic Oath, you read Galen, the role of the doctor is not to treat symptoms, it's to move any obstructions out of the way so that the body can heal itself. That's what a doctor's supposed to do. But we've gone so far past doctors violating their sacred oath and being co-opted by the pharmaceutical companies, insurance companies, and every other industry, that there's not even I've worked in the medical field for over a decade. I used to repair medical equipment. That's what my education's in, biomedical engineering. They don't even pretend that it's about that anymore. Because once people, if you don't demand it, you're not going to get it. And if all you demand is more drugs, then that's what you're going to get. And you have a populace now, especially where I live, not everybody, I don't want to generalize, but a lot of people, that's what they want is another drug. And if they say now psychedelics are going to fix it, I know a lot of people around here that everybody's picked up on this psychedelic thing. Everybody. It's Michael Pollan mainstreamed it. People I know from my little home county, even though they don't read or even use the internet, they know, they have picked up on the lines. Psychedelics heal this. Da 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 da. It's just in the air.
I was just saying the other day, like in our chat, I was watching a CNBC little mini, like 11-minute little section that they were playing on the 5-day work week, the 40-hour work week, and how that's impacting mental health, and talking with various researchers and nonprofit people about how cutting down to a four-day work week, 32 hours, getting the same pay, how that could positively affect mental health. And I sent the team like a message, and I was like, in that 11 minutes, I heard more like valid arguments about mental health and causes than I hear in, the psychedelic renaissance space. So that's rare to hear something like that for me. It's just more of take the pill. Don't worry.
Yeah.
We don't even talk about how the environment has changed and how the social fabric has changed. I don't want to say it's off limits, but it's really not part of the discussion. It's minimal.
Yeah, and let me say something that connects to what David was saying. If you're a scientist and you think scientifically, and you have one set of conditions to where there was essentially no mental illness, there was all these problems that we have today, there was no deaths of despair, no opioid crisis, let's just use those, no record alcoholism and suicidality. And then you have another set of conditions, clearly definable, mostly that you can draw right to public policy and economic policy. And one of them produces terrible results and the other one doesn't. There's two paths. Science, which would say, well, let's take all that stuff away and see if it gets better first. The path of magic says, well, let's add a new drug and magically it'll heal the world. That's not scientific. That's magical thinking.
Well, yeah, and seeing the pushback we've gotten for trying to advance some systemic critique to sort of look at those larger components, systems, structures, what have you, and being told either that that's too big or that's beyond the scope of, say, psychologists. Like there's two people who sort of spring to mind on that are Mark Fisher and Jordan Peterson, right? Where on the one hand, you've got Mark Fisher saying it goes without saying that all mental illnesses are neurologically instantiated, but this says nothing about their causation. If it's true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. And then on the other hand, you've got someone like Jordan Peterson, who, I appreciate him for stating it so bluntly some years ago, who basically said, look, the the role of the psychologist is to return people to some sort of functionality within, you know, the pre-existing structures. And it's sort of like, okay, so you see your role as restoring people to functionality within an inherently fucked up system. No need to change the system, no need to restructure that. And I think, you know, those are fundamental differences and questions and questions that are facing psychedelia at the moment.
If they don't want to face them, then there's not even any reason to pay it. It's just bullshit. We know there is. They're just trying to sell something. That's all it is. So there's no need to really, there's nothing past that. It's totally obvious. They're just trying to sell something. It's a new industry. A bunch of people want to make a bunch of money. They're going to tell anybody who questions it to shut up. And then later they'll say, God, can you believe that happened? And we'll say, yeah. Well, actually,
we were trying to tell you.
Group of people that, you know, that's what I tell, you know, my dad, I'll say my dad he's not anymore, but he was always very conservative. And my brother, I graduated high school in 2001, you know, of course, I graduate in June, the September 11th attack happens. My brother was over there, on the first boat over, so-called Operation Iraqi Freedom. Anyway, my dad was all for the war. He's going to hate me for saying that, but it's true. Oh, we got to get them. They attacked us, blah, 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 blah. Well, 20 years later now, he says, can you believe that? Bankrupted the country, ruined that country, this country. Yeah, actually, I can't believe it because I was reading Noam Chomsky.
Right,
and he was
right.
saying, don't do it. So it's this, and this just happens over and over, as y'all know. It just happens over and over and over again. And every new thing. That's why this big Silicon Valley is so tied into it. Elizabeth Holmes. I was reading Sam Bankman-Fried last night. This is going to change the world. It's going to fix everything. As soon as they say that, you would already know. Reach for your wallet. This is going to fix it all. That's what they said about computers. Everybody should read. There was a few years ago, January 2017, I think. Fred Turner, who's a great historian at Stanford, wrote a front page article, cover article for Harper's, and it was about the history of the internet. He writes books about the counterculture history of the internet. He's phenomenal. What he showed was the rhetoric that was being used when the internet came out. And he has a speech by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan says, the microchip will be the greatest advancement for human freedom ever. Everybody said it's going to be an interconnected utopia of just totally cooperative angels. And then Fred Turner says, and then it led to the election of Donald Trump and the bolster of authoritarianism.
Well, and when you point to that, one of the things that jumps to mind is Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin claiming that color TV and weed was going to lead to the revolution, that people would get stoned and see it in vivid Technicolor, and that would inspire such change. And like, big if true, but 60 years later, we look and we see, and it's like, I don't know about that.
Look how quick the conversation around social media evolved. You know, it was social media. I mean, okay, let's take MySpace out of it because MySpace was, I don't know. You can even put that in the conversation, but it didn't last. Facebook wiped it out really quickly, right?
Yeah.
I think Facebook pretty much opened the doors to non-college people in something like 2007. But all those people promoting social media as, you know, this fix, this interconnection, all the things that can be done about it. And then, you know, zoom forward, not even 10 years, a little bit plus 10 years. And now the conversation, the people who are raising legitimate criticism at the time of what social media could be used for, they were shut down. They were the skunk at the, you know, Silicon Valley party. Oh, yeah. And now you fast forward and it's like a gigantic fucking fire of fascists everywhere online, and the conversation is around, you know, how do we censor, you know, and how do we prevent that from being out there? It doesn't take too long for these like capitalist fixations to kind of come full circle, you know?
Boomerang.
I mean, what was that, Dave?
boomerang, like
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't take long.
chickens
It's just
coming home
that
to roost.
initial descent is really suppressed at the beginning because it's inconvenient to a whole lot of people. I mean, the crypto industry right now is facing so many, like you brought up with SBF,
Yeah.
like they've become, Bitcoin was started because of the financial crash. The first block has whatever the I don't know if it's New York Times or Wall Street Journal, whatever. Has the newspaper headline on it. Um, that was the whole point of it. And now it's like within a very short period of time, that whole movement it's Wall Street now, right? And so they're trying to undo certain aspects of of what it became. You couldn't imagine uh 12 years ago that I guess some people could imagine it was probably going to become what it's become. But I don't know. It's just interesting seeing the same sort of arc in psychedelia has played out in so many other industries, and it's just endlessly fascinating to me to see.
Yeah, it's just the same marketing campaign. That's what I part
It's
of
the
really
same
what I've been doing.
economic system underneath.
The
It's
same
literally
economic system,
it's the same people.
the same marketing campaign. That is, how do we? Oh, everything's screwed up. Is there any quick way to fix it? That's what it amounts to. Well, the gap between the rich and the poor is huge. Well, Sam Bankman-Fried, I'll take the money from the rich people and give it to the poor. It was a Robin Hood thing. Okay, yeah, magic. We'll create something for nothing. We'll fix everything without doing any actual work or changing anything. That's what it all boils down to.
Win, win, win.
Yeah.
Everybody wins. No one has to give
everybody
anything
wins.
up.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, the weird
Everybody
thing
wins.
recently was I forget what magazine that was. Everyone was over the summer or something. I don't know if it was Time or whatever. The headline of Prozac, they were comparing it in a
I just saw someone
non-ironic
tweet
way.
about it today, even
Jeez.
that
It was just
that
weird
Prozac
because
versus yeah.
it was weird because it was in a non-ironic way, you know? It it was like comparing putting both Prozac and psychedelics in like this conversation of this is going to be this new wonder drug.
and no consideration of the trajectory of Prozac and what actually happened. It's like, hey, look, mushrooms are now inhabiting the throne. It's like,
Yeah.
So one of the other things that you write about in the piece, which I think was surprising to some people, is so you have Ralph Hood. He comes up with this scale to measure people's responses to mystical experiences. That then gets incorporated into Johns Hopkins and is sort of the primary scale that they're using to write this paper, put that paper out, and so much of what's happened over the last 15, 16 years now is that paper sort of at the genesis, in a sense, of this new movement right now, sort of the new medicalization movement. But you write about how Ralph is opposed to medicalization. Now, can you talk a little bit about sort of Ralph's orientation around medicalization, some of his thoughts about how how his scale has sort of been lent to the university, whose
Yeah. Well,
work has
he's
led to this expanded
yeah.
field now.
Well, he's as he's. I think it's in there in the very beginning. He says, you know, I'm not against it. He's not against the medical research. He's friends with Bill Richards. He loves Roland and all them. He's not against the research, but the research doesn't necessarily have to be used to just hand it over like everything else, like the tech we were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
computers. It's developed with public money under the guise of the military and then handed over to Microsoft so they can make money off of it after we pay for it and then sold back
Yep.
to us. And this isn't. So this is philanthropy money. They're getting some NIH money now for a smoking cessation, but it's philanthropy money. But yeah, he's against the medical research. He's for them. He's for the research. Hey, let's find out as much as we can about it. I'm for the research. I volunteered for it. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but he's against it being used as an incubator for pharmaceutical products. Why can't we just investigate the nature of the experience? And Roland's for that. I think he's for that. That the money, as he says, the money comes from people that are interested in developing therapeutics. That's where the money comes from. But Hood's view is just that he says right in the beginning of the article, he says pharmaceutical companies will do anything to get you hooked on a drug that you have to take for the rest of your life, and they're doing everything they can to prove him right. All you have to do is read Nature, Neuron, all these new papers that are coming out. Oh, can we do them without the trip? Because then it'll be cheaper, and the insurance company can pay for it, and you can take it all the time. There was a great, everybody should watch this interview where Uma Thurman interviews Christian Angermeyer. And she says, well, what the problem with this stuff is you can only have to take it once. He said, what can you do about that? And if anybody's watching, no, he goes, oh, well, we'll just come up with new diseases all the time. He goes, there's all kinds we haven't even discovered yet. He goes, being afraid of the world, the future, we'll just create new diseases. And he said, we'll never run out of customers.
Yeah, I've listened to a podcast with him where he basically said, like, no, we should kind of keep ramping up industrial cities and all this, and then psychedelics will be a nice like maintenance thing for this condition that we've now put ourselves in for our mental states and stuff.
That interview's amazing. That interview's amazing because she says, what do you think's causing all this mental illness? And he says, oh, definitely technology. He goes, it's causing all, and he goes, but it's good, because then the audience is like, hold up, what? And she's like, she has this look on her face. Watch the interview. Look at her face. She's stunned by what he's saying. And he goes, well, yeah. He goes, but it's because we're on our way to the future. He goes, the future will be awesome, but this riffraff, they're having a hard time understanding what us smart guys know. Us seers and mystics, we see this amazing future with Elon Musk and space shuttles, and we're going to go to Mars, blah, blah, blah. But on the way, everybody's gone nuts, but I'm going to fix it with this drug that everybody's going to have to take. Yeah. It's the most amazing interview I've ever seen related to
Plute's going to plute.
But this is the beauty of like people like that, or like, reading things in the business press. Like, they'll just tell you what they think, know, and there's no recognition of like the horrific consequences of that, or like the pathologization of aging, or like just looking at, I mean, and thinking back to his comments during the initial outbreak of the pandemic, and pushing hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, and insisting that he knew it was right, even though there'd been, it was all like early
he was
days.
telling people to take it.
Oh yeah, hardcore. Oh, yeah. He said it should be that
He's probably got money in that too.
Should go ahead and just like make it available for COVID sufferers. He challenged us to a debate when we pushed back, and then of course the actual evidence came in, and it's been crickets ever since.
Well, I wish I could get him on a debate. I don't know. He won't answer my email.
Yeah.
Well, I think that disregard for
friends.
For reality is important in context of people like this pushing pharmaceutical products, right? Like, personally, I'm with you. I'm agnostic when it comes to psychedelic research. I think it would be fascinating to see some more sort of phenomenological research. Like, personally, like, I find on mushrooms, like, I see consistent like body patterning that's there from one trip to the next. I've talked with other people who also have similar visual experiences. It's like, is that coming from something relating to the ocular nerve? Is that coming from something in the brain? Like, what is the what is the source of this? Is this something like, like probing, like figuring out ways to actually tease apart some of that? Maybe you don't get anything actionable out of it, but also like, what the hell is going on? Not in the sense that we somehow might crack the ultimate riddle of life, the universe, and everything, but really just to be able to ask more and more interesting questions about whatever the hell is going on.
Yeah, and I do think it's important to separate what Hopkins is doing, and I can't speak of any other psychedelic research program because I don't know about any of the other ones except for Hopkins. And to separate that is, as Roland pointed out to me, it's a bunch of different. There's 5, 6, 7, 8 different people there. They've all got their own opinions. I would not try to associate Christian Angermeyer and his views with Roland. Let's do the research, but that has nothing to do with someone like Angermeyer saying, the example I always use, tell me if this makes sense or not. One thing I learned reading Riddle's book about Galen, about Galen, ancient physician from the 2nd century, very famous physician known all over the land for what a great doctor he was. But he also wrote all these books. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of books about drugs and pharmacy and healing and da. But he says, this is the Hippocratic Oath. A doctor this is what separates a doctor from a priest and a magician. This is 2,000 years ago, and it stands till today. The doctor refuses untreatable patients. If I go to the doctor and I say, my girlfriend broke up with me, you know what he should say? that's not a medical problem. Go talk to your mom or something. They don't, if they give you pills, that's a violation. But the priest and the magician, Galen says, they will treat anything, including diseases, and especially diseases they created themselves. So a priest says, you've got sin, but good news, I can fix it. Right? So Christian Angermeyer says, okay, we caused everybody mental illness with this other business I got going on, but I have the cure too.
I don't think he go. I don't think he's. I don't think
He doesn't acknowledge.
That he's involved in tech. That
He
he's
sort
involved
of
in-
has. I've listened to interviews where he sort of acknowledges the trajectory that cities are going to be like nature is going to become more and more sparse as technology and industrial cities become more and more populous and this becomes more of a thing, and that we'll need drugs like psychedelics to sort of assuage that declining of natural exposure and things like that. And he is involved in all the tech stuff.
He's involved with it. And in the Uma Thurman interview, he says he quickly corrects himself, and he says he goes, "I'm a super fan of disruption." That's a quote. He says, "I'm a super fan of disruption," meaning I'm a super fan of disruption, meaning people killing themselves and all the problems we're having. That's the disruption he's a fan of. That he considers these are okay casualties because the future is going to be so awesome. This is not
Collateral damage.
This collateral damage of going to what he calls the future. This is not a caricature of what he says. This is exactly what he says.
But okay, so and hopefully this doesn't put anyone in too awkward of a position, but that collateral damage framing does have parallels with things that have come out of Hopkins, like as far as, Matt Johnson getting up at the Horizons conference and saying, look, as this scales up, people are going to get hurt. Or, some of the dismissive responses we've gotten from Bill Richards when we and other Hopkins researchers when we've tried to bring some of the participant harms to them and say, hey, this is going on. Like, would you engage with this? Would you? Hey, you're advising a company in Australia that's doing some really harmful stuff. Would you consider distancing? And the lack of engagement there. And it's not everyone at Hopkins, but like getting some of those responses where it's like how to break up some of that magical thinking, how to disrupt the narratives about collateral damage and the notion that the ends somehow justify the means. I mean, it's disturbing to hear people so willing to write off study participants in the, in service to a narrative about a better, brighter future that psychedelics will eventually bring us, if only we can do more research that in some cases really disregards participants. Like how does that resolve itself? What is that, how to tease those apart?
So you're saying in the Hopkins, specifically concerning Hopkins, you're saying people that got hurt in the trial, like I did, like I do the trial and they get messed up, and then, is that what you mean?
So when
you know more, because I just want to say that all you guys know more about psychedelic research than I do as far as the big overview. You guys have been reporting on it as journalists, breaking stories. I haven't done that. And though I keep up with some of it, I don't know everything about it.
Totally. No, and I think, so things that have been put on the record, I think at this point are, in the case... Well, actually, I'll flag that one later because I want to ask you some questions about epistemic authority and sort of who gets to, the tension between researcher and participants, particularly in reflections on mystical experiences. But like the things that come to mind, so we were just talking about, say, Hopkins and Christian Angermeyer or Compass or Attai. And, when we early days, when we tried to bring some of our concerns about Compass to Bill Richards, he just dismissed them out of hand. Didn't want to hear anything about it, referred to some of our follow-up reporting as sort of tabloid journalism, did an interview where he sort of, I don't know how authentic they were or weren't, but he cried very big tears about the idea that people were unfairly attacking George Goldsmith and Compass Pathways. And, they certainly didn't want to patent and lock everything down in the way that they were being made out to be. And or the other thing that comes to mind is, like I said, at Horizons, in the wake of some of our reporting, as researchers were, I guess, publicly grappling with some of this, with Matt Johnson sort of, again, espousing this collateral damage idea that, yes, psychedelic medicine is going to scale up and people are going to get hurt, and sort of presented as a matter of fact, that's just the way it is. Like,
Do you think, and is the way you interpreted that okay, field trip out there, there's all these patients going, and somebody's gonna, take a trip and go crazy and go kill somebody. Do you think that's what he was referring to, or what do you think he was referring to, or all different varieties of fucked up shit that could happen?
I took it like I would like to take it, I guess, at face value and take it as broadly as I understood it as it was relayed to me. Just that there are things are unforeseen, things are going to happen. I would point to it being like there's currently a very small research participant pool. There's been the studies are small, and this is what I'm saying. I'm not opposed to psychedelic research. I'm agnostic. I think too, one of the big things to consider in the moment, and this goes to some of Hood's concerns about medicalization as well. Yeah. If this is not about, just sort of asking interesting questions about drugs, but developing pharmaceutical products and agents that can be sold to people to cure whatever ails them, suddenly it's not about weirdos who are excited to go into a Hopkins study for the grab bag of drugs they might get. And it becomes maybe people who would never do a psychedelic, who might say, I have no interest in ontologically, blowing up my ontological understanding of everything around, or experiencing really weird altered states or feeling, having out of body experiences, but I'm a trauma sufferer. I'm a depression. I've suffered depression for years and nothing else has worked. And I've heard that this might be it. So, I will white knuckle it and strap in for a psychedelic experience in the hope of curing that. And all of a sudden you have entirely different people flocking to this drug on the back of those narratives or these drugs.
I think that's a really good point. And I think two things. One, there's a quote, something I told Roland was a quote out of a book, and here's what it is, and it applies just to what you're saying. Wendell Berry asked in his newest book, on what scale is it possible for humans to think and eventually not be surprised by large-scale bad results? On what scale is it possible for humans to think and eventually not be surprised by large-scale bad results? Right? Technology amplifies, we'll scale this up really quick. Yeah, well, then the answer to your question is they should be held responsible. If you know that what you're going to do is going to cause this, then it's no different than the invasion of Iraq. So what do? You pay fake experts and industry people that work for the Defense Department. No, it'll work out perfect. There was a front page of the New York Review of Books the other day, an article, This United States. It was a guy, he said, I handled the war in Iraq. I know all about them, and I made sure that it went okay. Well, we know how well that went. And he said, now... he goes, now we need to split up the North and the South of America. And he said, I'm going to handle it. And I know the way it should be done, blah, blah, blah. So the point I'm trying to make is, if the evidence that we have is based on a couple hundred people, and all those people, well, they can't be 20 to 50, no problems. Well, the people that need help the most are all fucked up on drugs. The people I know. Are you going to just, who's going to get to do it? Because all we know is about people that are already doing okay. Does that make sense? I mean, that's just my opinion. Is I think, there's no telling what could happen if you start if you start giving psychedelics. And I think Roland would agree with that. I'm trying to think back to what the last time I talked to him, what he said. But there's no way to know. And so it is fuck it, let's scale it up and see what happens.
I think what you generally, this is just my opinion, but I think what you'll generally see is that there'll be a lot of positive results from people, whatever mental condition that they have. I think that you're gonna scale that up, I think, and I think that you're also gonna scale up the adverse events. You're gonna have a sizable portion of people who are worse off than they went into the trial or the therapy. In the current hype in the industry, we just don't really talk about that, the underbelly of that too much. It's being talked about more over the last year. It's certainly been picked up on and discussed more, and the adverse events in the Compass trial, more people are picking up on that. More non-psychedelic people are picking up on that. But that's what I generally think will happen. Is you're scaling up if you're scaling up what's already present in the trials, you're gonna have you're gonna have way more.
Of course. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and like we've said a
It's not
couple
really
times
a-
recently on podcasts, is like this is the most supervised it's ever going to be, or like this is like the most attention that's ever going to be paid to like oversight too, and that's a little scary too as you think about scaling it up really quickly, and there's already adverse events going on and stuff not being sort of paused and reflected on and improved.
Learn from, yeah.
And I can see an argument being made of somebody saying, "Look, everything's why not? Maybe it'll work." It's like but that seems to be the attitude with everything. Well, let's just see if it works. Like we were talking about Appalachia, they said, "Well, we're going to bring you into the future. We know you got a system that works. It's not perfect, but we're going to bring you into the future and make a bunch of money while we're doing it. And if it, a couple hundred years, your whatever his disruption, causes grandma to die, well, oh well, So,
and in many cases, that disruption is pretty immediate. Like, say, with rideshare companies who just obliterated taxi workers who just paid multiple $100,000 for their medallion, and they go kill themselves because of it. Because their medallion just totally got wiped out. This happened all over the place.
I just want to say this. I don't think you can talk about what we were just talking about without talking about the nature of the problem it's supposed to treat. It's being sold as a medical treatment. So what medical condition does it treat? Most of the people I know's problem, all of them. Most people's problem isn't. I've done the study. I know it's great. It can give you a new philosophy of life. Most people I know, their problem isn't they need a new philosophy on life. Most of them are there's no jobs. All the problems that y'all already know, and
we're back to material reality.
Everybody
material reality. Their problem isn't that they need a transcendent experience. I'm for it. I hope they do, but there's a lot of other things they need, and we shouldn't allow people to experiment on people that already got so many fucking problems. They don't need you experimenting on them. All that shit.
So I think this actually really interestingly mirrors the point that Taves Taves makes, right? Where this when she says, if scientists fail to make a clear distinction between scientific claims based on empirical evidence and theological claims based on revelation or tradition, they risk setting mystical experiences apart from similar experiences on theological rather than scientific grounds. Yeah. And if we look at some of the sort of, what makes psychedelics different, what makes psychedelics special? Oh, well, they can occasion mystical experiences that will give you this moment of new perspective and reflection on life and appreciation for this, that, and the other. But as you point out, when your material conditions remain unaffected, and those are, at the crux of what is driving whatever issues you're dealing with, like it seems like there's this belief, this almost theological belief, that psychedelics will somehow overcome that in face of empirical evidence that suggests otherwise.
That's purely what it is, too. It's important for people to understand it. That's purely what it is. It is a magical belief, traceable back to some of it romantic novels like Aldous Huxley's Island, published in 1962.
Can you unpack?
Yeah.
You just made a bold claim, and I'd love for you to unpack exactly what.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've heard Rick Doblin talk numerous times, and I talked to him on the phone once, and he brought up, not me, referenced Aldous Huxley's Island. And he said, look, what I learned from Aldous Huxley's Island is that you can't just have it, it can't just be small groups of people here and there cloistered about. We can't just any longer be little pockets of people using psychedelics. It has to be worldwide. And what happens in Ireland is they take psychedelics and they turn it into the religion and they incorporate it into life. It was Aldous Huxley's last book, and it was the opposite of Brave New World. If you put them together, Brave New World's the bad way it can go, and Island's the good way it can go, right? And so but I should also say, to back up my bold claim, is that all of this literature is romantic literature, including William James. Religion is a subcategory of religious literature or romantic literature. Utopianism is a form of romanticism. D.H. Lawrence, William Blake, who coined the doors of perception. Aldous Huxley is a romantic novelist. He's being cited in scientific papers. You don't really need any more evidence than that. He's a romantic. Think about it. Aldous Huxley is not a scientist. He is a romantic novelist, and he's a very interesting guy. He's fucking smart, but he's sort of I don't know. I wouldn't trust him. And he made his money as a Hollywood screenwriter. He's made his money as a Hollywood screenwriter. Do you see? Aldous Huxley is not an authority on anything. He was a disillusioned artist. So I don't know how far I'm going to go with a plan that's let's mix central planning with pharmaceutical companies and the dreams of a dead disillusioned artist to create some new worldwide religion or something that's going to fix everything.
Let's talk.
This is roughly what you're talking about. Is what you're talking about.
Yeah, more than roughly. That was beautifully articulated. Thank you.
Let's probably wrap on. Well, I want to talk about this thing, and then maybe we can wrap. But one of the things you talk about is the quote psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness. You get into it later down in the piece. I just want to read this couple paragraphs here. You write that some believe that these theological premises are being obscured by researchers who have both an ideological and in some cases financial interest in bringing psychedelics to market. Add to this fact that psychedelics are now being hyped as the answer to all our problems, and a troubling picture emerges. Did the scientists of religion, attempting to model the natural sciences and systematize religions, accidentally synthesize them, creating a new scientific subgenre of Christianity that they themselves could believe in? What's really happening at Johns Hopkins might be the flowering of a new psychedelic spirituality grounded in Jamesian mysticism, with psilocybin, quote-unquote, therapy replacing the ancient initiation ceremony. Dr. Rick Strassman calls it the psychedelic religion of mystical consciousness. It's a messianic movement, Strassman told me. They want to bring about a utopia, and in this case, the Messiah is the mushroom.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Let me just finish.
Yeah.
A couple
Sorry.
Just one more paragraph here. The current psychedelic movement or renaissance, he says, is essentially the emergence of a new mystico-scientific religion, quote, camouflaged by scientific studies and statistical firepower, end quote, with its own Moses, William James, and cult vocabulary. Psychedelics, occasion, effects, adverse effects are now challenging. Flashbacks are reactivations. And if you read the articles, they all start to borrow the same language. There's a philosophy of James, Strassman says, and then there's his theology, which was inspired by his connection with Swami Vivekananda. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
I think that's right.
Yeah, so this is something. This was interesting for me to read Strassman talk about this, because this is like something that's been, I think, bouncing around in my mind quite a while. Is that it gives me the vibes of sort of like a new, especially thinking about Bill Richards and his influence at Hopkins and his book Sacred Knowledge, if you've read that, and then just thinking about perennialism and the roots of all these things. It does give those vibes of this new kind of subgenre of Christianity. How can you not like kind of feel that?
Yeah, well, two things. One, religious studies. If you read the latest well, they've been arguing this for decades, but if you read the biggest scholars and the main scholars in the U.S., I'll say Joseph Storm. Over in Europe, in Vienna, there's Julian Struve. What you'll learn is that the history of religious studies is not a secularizing force. The field of religious studies has really been used to constantly. There's constant new religious revivals and mystical revivals as a result of a lot of the people. If you read Jeff Kripal, for instance, who's really interested in psychedelic research, he makes the same argument that most of the people, it's like psychedelic research. The people who are in religious studies usually believe the stuff of, they're people that are interested in magic and religion. Do you see what I'm saying? It's sold as religious studies people argued against it. They'd say, well, it's a secularizing force. That's not really true. If you look at it, it's all intertwined with theosophy and spiritualism, and all the occultists and all the people are all mixed in with it. So what I'm saying is this: is it the emergence of a new mystico-scientific religion? Well, you're taking specific religious teachings, like the idea of a common core, perennial mysticisms, and all this, which are the most common thing in religious studies. It's just a huge part of it. And the people that have believed this go back hundreds and hundreds of years. mysticism. I was just talking to Jason Joseph Storm today, and he told me that even that word mysticism is really a theological concept. It's not a scientific concept. But I'll just say this about Strassman. I don't think I'm being clear, but what Strassman's really talking about is, if you read Weston LaBar, if you're interested in psychedelics, you should read Weston LaBar's book, The Ghost Dance. It's one of the best books on what he called hallucinogens and religion. And what the whole book's about is crisis cults and their relationship to psychedelics. And so what Strassman is essentially saying is that it's a crisis cult. And if you listen to the rhetoric from the psychedelic researchers and from the people selling them, they will constantly tell you that the species is threatened. And this is one of the main reasons why questions must be suppressed. By an anthropological definition, that's a crisis cult. So this is that's part of what he's arguing. And then I think the rest is in the article. Yeah, I love that you got to love that in America, everything is just constantly given some new futuristic sounding language. And that's why it's an activate. Well, I want to have an activation. It's like Total Recall. It makes it sound cool. Everybody wants to have it. Anyway, I don't know. The religious, or I could go so deep into this, but the science of religion, the people said if you read the literature, they were not studying religion from a scientific perspective. That's really not what they were doing. All of them were interested in religion, and they would pull particular texts from particular places. They thought it was secular looking at it, but they could only take Max Mueller, who's a predecessor to William James. He could only get a certain number of texts from India and these other places in order to make these presumptions that, yep, there's a common core. And so what it has done is, after it's filtered out so long, even by the time it got to James, it had already reached a level of refinement. And that's why Taves says mystical experience is a high-end product. It's essentially an artistic literary concept. It's a really high, Swasserstrom. There's a great book by Swasserstrom called Religion After Religion. Sometimes they call it Religion 2.0. What this was going to be is a more scientific version of religion. And people like James, they couldn't buy into the going to church every day and worshiping God. They didn't want to have anything to do with that. They needed something that they could believe. And that was, give me a shot. They could believe that. And so that's essentially what it is they've pushed all just like if you're mining coal, if you have a mountain down in eastern Kentucky, they say, well, you look at the mountain and you go, wow, that's beautiful, a natural source of awe and wonder. They say, no, it's not. It's a collection of minerals. Some of them are worth money and some of them aren't. So they blow the whole thing apart. They take $500-600 worth of coal, and then you're left with the end result. And essentially what these people are doing is saying, well, fuck community, fuck the church, fuck morality. Let's just turn it into a drug. And that's what it is.
Mainline some essential perennialism.
And it is interesting, and it is an interesting experience. So I'm not discouraged. I don't think anybody should do anything illegal, but I'm also not arguing that it's not interesting, and that I don't find even the Huxley idea and the Doblin idea, hey, whatever. I mean, we've been through so much here where I live. We've been going to the future for hundreds of years now, and you see where we're at. So where are we going next? Maybe if it's Elon Musk president, we'll go to Mars. If Doblin's president, we'll go to fucking hyper mystery school. Wow.
I really appreciate the crisis cult framing. That's fascinating and something that on surface seems to click and jive with a lot that we've discussed lately. And I definitely want to dive more into that. But also thinking about sort of some of Strassman's positionality around this, where it's it's so interesting to read some of the critiques or commentary he offers in your article, because it's he's got, or at least he had, a horse in that race. And thinking about the whats and the whys of his own horse, whether it's his affinity for Kabbalistic Judaism, or if it's, looking at him shutting down his studies as people were having these really uncomfortable entity encounters, maybe, rather than experiences of the divine mystery or clearly explicit sort of religious themes or what have you. There's, I think, almost in a sense, mirroring psychedelic experiences themselves. There's a lack of sort of lining up in a really clear way with some of, I don't know, his professed interests or his desires or what he was hoping to get from the study. I mean, it's been ages since I read The Spirit Molecule, but thinking about some of the commentary, especially as things got real weird towards the end of the study and then sort of pulling the plug. And thinking too about like why, so to the earlier question of why does Hopkins maybe get all the glory for sort of restarting the psychedelic renaissance or whatever, Hopkins is still around, still kicking, doing whatever, rather than having a bunch of people still trying to grapple with why the hell did I meet this insectoid and think that they were going to do odd medical experiments on me.
Yeah. I mean, wasn't Strassman kind of concluding towards the end and why he stopped that it was sort of bigger than science, that it was like an experience that he wasn't quite grappling, or like that he didn't feel like it was hard to quantify?
Well, also that they had him down in New Mexico. They had him in like the closet of some emergency room or something. So he never, they approved him to do psilocybin, and so he was going to try to do therapeutic stuff, but he didn't have a suitable place, and he quit. He stopped the research because he said, "Look, we need to move this off base somewhere we can really do this scientifically," and they said, "No way in hell we're approving that." So then he shut down.
Gotcha.
Too bad. What could have been is that's interesting. I want to do a study with Strassman. He's cool.
Yeah,
he's far out.
It's so fascinating to just think about where we'll be in 10 years with psychedelic medicalization. Will it have succeeded? Will it have failed? Will it have been like? Will we be having the FTX conversation of how the fuck did we allow that to happen? Is it going to get, is it going to go so sideways? I think the ketamine thing going on right now will end up going sideways, but, we don't know how it's actually going to play out. So much stuff has just changed. I was thinking about in this conversation of, it's like in the psychedelic renaissance now, it's just so common to say psychedelics as medicines. We don't hear that in the 60s though. It's more consciousness focused, right? You don't really hear. I don't know about it like as referring to medicines back in the 60s. And what's that going to do when we're trying to really force these compounds into a box? Into a very tightly.
Well, it's going to put them
box
into the hands of like a certain class of people, and I don't know, leave some people out. I guess that's how I feel.
And if they can get Medicaid to pay for it, that's the whole thing, is to get Medicaid, because then you can size it up real quick if you can get the money.
I don't see it happening, but
I don't know if it will. I wouldn't be surprised, but otherwise, I don't think it'll be that successful. I think people are just going to do it on their own. Even here, they don't have any technology in which you can't figure out. I know. So this is a small state. Hell, everybody takes psychedelics, colluding with everything else, and they don't have no mystical, none of that. They just take psychedelics with this, that, and they take it whatever. They're not. Most of the people I know are doing it just willy nilly, concerts and this and that. But I don't think you'll be able to. The knowledge is out there. Hell, you can read Sacred Knowledge and get the playlist and everything and try to recreate it yourself.
Yeah, but there's so much. There's a group of people who want to do DIY type stuff, who want to do that. But look, all the information so much drug information is just sitting there for free on Arrowhead. Yeah. But yet there's like this huge market for coaches, and people don't want to do their own research. They want to be told, this is how you do it, blah blah blah. So
well, that goes right back to Huxley's Island, because the question Huxley Island here's the question Huxley asked an island and sets out to illustrate. He says, is the human predicament solvable by growth and awareness? He essentially, can psychedelics cure stupidity? If not, it ain't going to work.
So it ain't going to work.
Because it goes to what you're saying. People, I don't know, just give it to me. So many people are like that. And I think we're all in that, like that in some way. So I don't want to set myself apart. Some people pay really close attention to some things, and other things they don't. Maybe they're very careful about what they eat, but they whatever.
Look, I mean, and if your depression is caused because you're like everybody else and you're in medical bankruptcy, it's much easier to just pop a pill than like even contemplate this Mount Everest of fucked up.
I mean, there's also
like, what are you gonna do?
to bring it back to like
checked out at that point,
systemic realities and material conditions. I mean, at the point where if you're working two jobs that are paying $7.15 an hour to just barely, to hover below the poverty line, where do you find the time?
Yeah, how are you gonna reconnect with nature if you work at a fucking Amazon warehouse and we got 5 or 6 of them right around where I live? How are you gonna reconnect with nature? That's one of the things. Psychedelics will make you reconnect with nature. Hell, a lot of people never even nature. They got to reconnect with nature. It shows you the essentially romantic notion of it. Oh, we'll reconnect with nature. What, I don't know.
Yeah, it's the end of spoiler alert for Soylent Green, but it's like the end of Soylent. It's a scene that not even the big scene, but when his buddy goes into that like the death place where you go to die, they have giant screens and you watch like the most beautiful parts of nature, before you're processed into food. That's how you go out, in a city that, I think I haven't watched the movie in years, but I think there's like a scene where, because they just have Soylent Green, and it's like subversive, it's against the law, and I think he brings in a strawberry or something like that. It's like this far out thing. You actually get a real, you actually get a real fruit, a real piece of food. This is weird.
Well, when you say that, it reminds me of the drive to connect psychedelics and virtual reality, and even leaving aside the whole question of data mining and surveillance capitalism and the whole dystopia that is emerging around that. Like, just looking at your point about Soylent Green, right? Like this notion of psychedelics afford nature connectedness. So here we have loaded your VR headset with the most lush, verdant landscapes you could possibly imagine, and you will cruise through them on your 25 milligrams of psilocybin. Like,
this is really funny.
God help us.
A few years ago, I was hanging out with Bill Richards, and I brought the question up about the differences. It was something like this, about the differences of taking psilocybin in like a clinical setting versus in nature, outside or something like that. It was really funny, but his answer to me is, well, it's better inside because you're tripping. You could be out in the woods and you could trip on a root.
You could.
That you could. That's why we needed a VR.
Trip on a root. I like that. Trip on a root.
Yeah. That's probably a good spot to wrap. Yeah, so I would definitely go check out, if you're interested in any of this, check out Travis's piece, Channel for Magic. It's really fascinating. You put a lot of ideas into my mind.
Cool.
With this
thank you guys for publishing.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, our pleasure.
For sure.
Going to do more in the future. Welcome back anytime. We've been talking in like a Signal chat about other things, and I've just continually been impressed in like your depth of like the history and the connections to I know
the breadth of
we're not going to get
like the interplay of all the different ideas. Like
but just like the the old school stuff, cults of Asclepius and all that stuff are really. We can't go down that rabbit hole now, but it's been really.
That could almost be a whole episode sometime.
I really want to talk about that.
I know. Well, we're definitely gonna have.
We'll have you back.
To talk about all that, and but yeah, it's been great. Thanks for.
Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it. It was good talking to you. Fun.
Likewise.